Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We are very excited to have all of you join us for today's very important webinar, which is brought to you by the Africa China Center for Policy and Advisory, the ACCPA. In a brief moment, I'll tell you more about the ACCPA. So today we're just having yet another conversation as we've been doing since the beginning of the year. This is part of a series of dialogues that we are hosting at the ACCPA. We had two already. This is our third for the year, and we're very excited that all of you are joining us for today's webinar. We're very excited to have a very distinguished research fellow who is going to share some perspective with us on a very important topic as far as Africa is concerned. So in 2024, it's anticipated to be a very kind of busy year when it comes to Africa-China relations. The reason is that, of course, there's a follow-up on what happened last year in South Africa, which is where even our main speaker is from, on the BRICS. So this year we're going to have the BRICS event, as well as we're going to have what we call the FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And that is what we are going to focus our discussion on today. And so we are very much excited. This conversation is in three parts. The first part is me going to do the introduction. The second part will be our main speaker giving us her perspective on the topic that we are discussing. And then the third part is where you come in as a participant. You have the chance to ask your questions, which our speaker will answer to her best of knowledge. So that is the part that we want you to be part of. We want you to engage our speaker today. So if you're very familiar with the Zoom app, there's a Q&A button on the Zoom app. That is what you're going to use to bring in your questions regarding the topic that we are having here today. So today we are focusing on what we call the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and the development agenda of African countries. We'll go deeper into that. But before that, the ACCPA, the Africa China Center for Policy and Advisory, we are a research, policy, and advisory firm headquartered in Accra, Ghana. We currently have a team in Botswana, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Tanzania, in the DRC, Ethiopia, and of course Ghana, where it's headquartered. Currently I'm even in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, for a program, and of course some of my team members are also here as well. So our work is cut out for us as a think tank. Our main focus is to bring the African perspective to bear when it comes to our relations with China. So what we are asking questions regarding what Africa thinks and what will be in the interest of Africa as far as our relation with China is concerned. And we believe that we have the responsibility to be a part of the conversation on how we chart our path with China. It cannot be that we will be lectured, every now and then on how we should relate with China. It is us as Africans. So we have the responsibility to decide and research and produce knowledge and help shape policy in terms of countries' relation with China. Of course, you're talking about 54, 55 different countries, with the exception of Eswatini, which does not have diplomatic relation with China. All countries on the African continent, one way or the other, are having dealings with China. So we believe that as an African think tank, we have to bring the African perspective to bear, and that's what we are doing. And as part of it is what we are having here today, to bring experts to the table to discuss relevant issues regarding Africa-China relations, which we believe is very important as we help to shape public policy and public perception and perspective. I believe that those of us that have joined the webinar today will leave here not the same. We're going to get some insights on what is really happening between Africa and China. So we are very much excited that you are making time to join us. You can visit our website, the Africa China Center for Policy and Advice. You can Google us, you can visit our website. In the course of the conversation, I'll put our website link there again. You can visit our website. We have a lot of such webinars coming up. At least from now until May, we have a series of webinars that are coming up. You can sign up ahead of time. You can also visit our YouTube channel. We have some of our recorded webinars there. Beginning of the year, we had a webinar on what we call, looking at what is supposed to unfold in Africa-China relation, which was very insightful. So you can check that webinar. That could be a precursor to this as well. So you can watch what really is expected to unfold between Africa-China relation in 2024. A couple of weeks ago, we had another webinar on trying to distinguish between facts from fiction in terms of what's happening between Africa and China. That is also available on YouTube channel. You can also go and watch that as well. So as a think tank, we're working with partners, both private and public. So if you're joining us and you are interested in any form of partnership regarding the work that we're doing, we are very much open to discuss that. I'll drop my email in the chats box or something. You can reach out to me directly. I'll be more than happy to pick up the conversation with you, whether you as a person or as your organization will be interested in the work that we do in the Africa-China space. We very much welcome you to reach out to us, and we will discuss that into details. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are very much getting straight into today's session. So before that, I would like to, of course, introduce our keynote speaker for today. So she is going to do the next 20-25 minutes of presentation. Then after that, we will do the Q&A, which is when you come in. So in the course of her presentation, please do send through your questions so that we can get her to answer them. That is why she's here, to help us, unpack everything around the FOCAC. So permit me to read her brief profile. So Sanusha Naidu is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue at the University of South Africa, that's UNISA. She is a foreign policy and political analyst based in Cape Town. Her work includes democracy, development, and political economy of Africa, Africa's international relations, and South Africa's foreign policy. So she is a foreign policy expert, if I should put it that way. She has also focused her interest on South-South cooperation and the footprint of emerging powers, China, India, and Africa. She has a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire in the UK. Currently, she's a senior research fellow, as I mentioned, at the Institute for Global Dialogue at UNISA. She has previously worked at the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town, and of course, managed the South African Foreign Policy Initiative. She has published extensively, including 2 edited books. She's a regular media commentator for South African and international media agents. And in fact, I met Sanusha a couple of weeks ago on the CGTN dialogue show. So I said, okay, wow, there is an expert. I need to have her on ACCPA platforms. So I reached out to her and she gladly accepted to do this webinar with us. So we are very much grateful for that opportunity, Sanusha. So today we are going to, as I did mention, a forum on China-Africa cooperation, FOCAC. We're going to really understand basically what the FOCAC is and what it has been shaping to be vis-a-vis Africa's own development interest and agenda. So we're trying to see how these two merges together, kind of create the kind of development journey that Africa wants, because that's our interest. What is really in it for Africa in terms of our own development journey, in terms of what FOCAC has been able to do since the inception in 2000. We have Agenda 2063 at our hand since January 2015. There are new developments. As I said, there are a lot of global happenings as well. This year, we're going to have BRICS in Russia, I think. FOCAC, the 9th edition is going to be in Beijing. So there are a lot of things happening, but we really want to delve deeper to understand how does this FOCAC connect or links up with Africa's own development agenda. So ladies and gentlemen, without much ado, I will welcome Sanusha to take us through the first phase, which is to hear from her the research that she has done on this topic. And then you can come in as well with your questions. So please don't forget to do that. Thank you. Sanusha, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of a very important platform. And I really like the work that you're doing with your center and the national teams that you're working with across the continent. I think it's vital and very, very important for us to have that continuous discussion, dialogue. But also, I think, your point that you made about how do you chart that kind of cohesiveness, and you coalesce the national interest not only at the national level, but at the subnational level as well. So this conversation on China and the discussions on China, I think, has evolved so much since I started off in this space, which was 2006 at the Center for Chinese Studies at Stellenbosch University. And I see one or two very familiar names on the chat, participants that are joining us today. So it's lovely to have old friends and reconnect with them. I think for me, and I'm going to share my screen, but I just want to make a few points. Firstly, let me put in one or two disclaimers, Paul. I don't know everything about FOCAC. That's the first thing. The second thing, I don't have the answers to the kind of development agenda that needs to now kind of reconfigure itself for Africa to move forward. And I just came back from teaching a course to international students that come on a program every year to South Africa. And one of the courses was the Africa-China engagement and introduction. And it then, kind of got me thinking about this presentation, and that is, how much do we actually understand the evolution of China and the evolution of Africa, and where does the meeting of the minds exist on what is the consensus approach? And you mentioned BRICS, and you mentioned FOCAC this year, but I think you got to also remember that there are other external partnerships, and this is for everybody in the room who's looking at China or looking at Africa's relationship with external partners, and it's what defines that engagement and what defines that relationship. What is the national interest? Is the national interest one big continental interest? Is it Agenda 2063? I have my own doubts about Agenda 2063. For me, I'm not sure I will be alive by 2063. So there's a sense here that we also have to remember there's a younger generation, a younger set of policymakers, potential leaders in this room and across the continent who will essentially be leading this continent in the next iteration or the second half of the 21st century. And it may be that they have different aspirations, or their aspirations are the same, but they have different interpretations of how they want to go forward. So I think this is the time for us to reflect on what is that navigation going forward. What are the navigational tools that we want for policy? And for me, if I can share my screen, I termed this. You asked me to think about this. Sorry, can you see the screen now?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. You asked me to talk about the national interest and the goals of African countries. And my question was, is it business as usual, or is it unusual for this year for FOCAC? And the reason I raise this is because I think we've got to be also realistic of what's happening in the continent. And you touched on this very importantly in terms of where FOCAC was in its inception to where FOCAC is going in terms of 2024. And I think we need to have a sober conversation about FOCAC. We need to have a sober conversation about Africa's national interest. But we also need to have a sober conversation about the regional context and the continental integration project, because these are not things that we can talk about in the context of what is Africa's agency, what is Africa's interest, because these interests are going to be different. And that's the first point of departure. That if you're looking at FOCAC 2024 and you're looking at FOCAC 2000, I think you've got to understand that things are moving. And the big FOCAC summit that happened in 2006 was the Heads of State Summit. And since then, we've seen a kind of, not decline, but we're seeing a kind of a realistic movement around where FOCAC is going. We've seen China change. China's global footprint, China's global engagements are moving further and further towards what is framing China's foreign policy, but what is framing China's identity in the global arena. And part of that is really understanding whether we are talking about this FOCAC actually consolidating the African engagement with China. And I think you can't do that as a one-size-fits-all approach. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach. But are we also moving further and further away from the Chinese, in a sense that is the expectation that we have on FOCAC is solely on how much we extract out of the Chinese in terms of the development finance package. And I think those are key things that we need to start thinking about, that the role, there are many Chinese layers of the Chinese engagement rather within the African context. It's the state to state engagement. It's the track 2, which is the policy think tank, the think tank engagement, the academic forum, and then of course there's the media space, the people to people engagement. It's the scholarships, it's development cooperation. It's all of these things that kind of become a licorice of all sorts. And I use that term not to be facetious, but I use it because it can mean many things to many people. And in a similar way, having spent some time at the business at the BRICS Summit last year, it's becoming that iteration as well. So if you're looking at for us in the room today, I think one of the key things for us is to go back and look at the narrative, look at the historical context of FOCAC, and start to ask ourselves what has been achieved, what has not been achieved, and what is actually kind of just hanging there, just in that space as a kind of stoic space that we have in the China-Africa or the Africa-China engagement. How much has Africa moved FOCAC? And to what extent has Africa moved FOCAC? Is it more based on the idea that the FOCAC program, in terms of the preferential loans, in terms of the infrastructure engagements, in terms of the partnerships around the build, operate, transfer model, the fact that you're going to get access to satellite TV for 10,000 African villages, how much does that move the African agenda on development? How much of that creates this kind of integrating Africa? And it's not just about talking about Africa in this broad context, but what are these advantages that we have that we are actually using at home, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Ghana, whether it's in Tanzania, or a far-flung village in Timbuktu, wherever we are in Africa, how much of this is actually creating the platform for us to actually define how we push the agency of this debate or this narrative or this engagement with China? So I think it's a number of different elements that need to come up. And sometimes I think with hindsight, we can also become a little bit more facetious. We can become a little bit more fickle, in a sense that we actually start to raise questions, and we should be asking those questions. I remember one of my political science professor said to me when I was studying, he said, the big role for many people as political scientists is to shine the light in the dark spaces and ask the awkward questions. I think FOCAC requires us to get to this point, because it has more than 20 years of existence, and how much of that has been achieved, which is very important. If we're looking at the last FOCAC summit, which was 2021, we're looking at the FOCAC summit that happened in 2018. We need to see how the dial has moved. What has been the upper limit in terms of the engagement? What has been less in terms of the credit lines to African financial institutions? What is increasing? What is decreasing? And how much of that creates not a dependency, but creates an expectation? And I'll come back to all of this in my conclusion in terms of raising more questions than answers. And that's why I use the disclaimer that I don't have the answers to these questions you're raising. I think it has to be a kind of important build up, a momentum, a mobilization. That agency doesn't just exist at the G to G level, government to government level. It exists at all levels of the engagement, whether it's a track 1, track 2, or track 3. But I think that this issue of continuity is also important to look at FOCAC this year. So one of the things that I've done is I've taken a few slides, and they're not my slides. You can see there's sources there that I thought will help us to frame the conversation in a manner that raises the question that as these think tanks engagements happen, as the track 2 engagements happen, is there real opportunity for us in Africa to engage with our Chinese counterparts, as well as with various other constituencies and institutions, both within Africa and within China, and to start saying, let's move away from this kind of engagement of this is the research projects we want to do. Maybe we want to have one big kind of important project that unpacks FOCAC in the 3 years that we have that interim or that interval between the last FOCAC summit and the next FOCAC summit. I think you're going to see continuity in terms of how do interest-free loans are applied in terms of cancellation. We're going to see the continuity around certain of the development cooperation around the people-to-people engagement, the engagements around scholarships and whatever. But one of the things I want to say is we need to be less kind of ecstatic about FOCAC and more pragmatic about FOCAC. And I think the reason I say this is linked to how we're looking at China in terms of the areas that are now becoming key drivers of China's global footprint. We started off with the BRI, infrastructure, ports, railways, highways, power stations, aviation, telecommunications. I think somebody said to me very recently when we did a study in South Africa, and I'll share that with Paul as well, is we looked at elite perceptions of the BRI in South Africa, and we were trying to extract and extrapolate, like, what is the thinking? Who actually knows what BRI is? And one of the things that we found was a comment that came, and we did do a policy brief, and it's on our website, and I can share the link there. But one of the things that was fascinating was one of the respondents said, BRI is like a development project on steroids. It was a very nice way to put it. I think one of the more kind of less kind of facetious or less kind of a kind of statement or a soundbite of what the respondent said is BRI is very nebulous. It can mean anything to anybody. It's got a very broad mandate. It's massive. But in this year, from last year to this year, even during the interruption of COVID, the questions have been raised about how much does the BRI actually expand on some of the commitments that the Chinese government have put into its funding of the Belt and Road. A key project in terms of reconfiguring the Silk Road and modernizing the Silk Road, overland, maritime security, all of that stuff, the overlaps. But then we hear in 2021, the Chinese launched the Global Development Initiative. And this now circles back again to the question around pandemic response, questions around human development and human security, areas of poverty reduction, the question of how the digital economy and the industrialization will help to create a much more a cohesive development agenda around human security, and of course pandemic response and vaccines, and of course the question of overlap between BRI around the digital, the green finance, the green BRI, climate change, and digital connectivity. And again, it's both. It's a question of multilateral, bilateral engagements, cooperation with international institutions, and it's also linked to I think the question of whether now we're seeing more loans, more development finance that China is going to give in, or are we seeing shifts in the policy bank lending? I apologize if the bottom has got cut off there, but the kind of capacity building and engaging in development, cooperation, etc., is not something that China is going to move away from. It's very much part of its soft power. It's very much part of that, and it plays a critical role in terms of Africa as well. The reason I'm raising this kind of overlap and between the GDI and then more recently or subsequently, you've got the Global Security Initiative, and you also have the Global Civilizational Initiative. It's about values as well. And it's about security of both the question of human security, but also the security around peace and stability. And I think what we're seeing in the context of the Middle East is critical as well to China's global and regional footprint as well. And I think what we need to start thinking about is this idea that there's a new era of development financing for China. It's small is beautiful. And this is what President Xi Jinping had mentioned. And it's becoming a key catchphrase that, overseas development finance, in terms of the years that we're looking at, according to the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, is we're seeing a decline. And we can't ignore that decline in terms of where it peaked and where it declined. Peaked around 2016, starting to decline after the 2018, 2019. And remember, with COVID, you would have those numbers show those trends and trajectories. But I think this also tells us, in terms of what's happening in the context of China, can we then just continue to look at FOCAC in this way, that there's going to be this development finance? How does small is beautiful get contextualized in the financial architecture and the financial range of China in terms of what it's going to be lending in? China is becoming risk averse in terms of what kind of projects it wants to take on. Are they looking for how they diversify some of their risk? How do they underwrite risk? And this is what we're beginning to see in terms of the number of commitments on the left axis, and of course, on the right axis, and the number and the committed amount. So I think there's an interesting trend that we have to be very conscious of as policy research think tanks, as people that are involved in the kind of engagement of the kind of relationship or relationships that African countries should have, because we cannot ignore the fact that the bilateral is very central and very a key pivot for the Chinese engagement in Africa. I mean, I think FOCAC is nice, but a lot of the bilateral is critical to how those relationships are crafted and the nature of those relationships going forward. So we have to bear in mind that 54 countries are essentially diverse as anything in terms of economy of scale. They are diverse in terms of where they are in their industrial development. They are diverse in terms of their financial architecture, and of course in terms of cultural and other experiences. And I think we can't just kind of look at this in a kind of one-stop gap measure, that this is where FOCAC is and this is what we need to think about. So I think there's a lot that we need to start thinking about, because China is changing, and changing rapidly, both domestically in terms of its economy, but also in terms of what's happening with the development finance commitments and what is being committed as amounts in terms of money. And you can see where this is going as well. I think to a large extent, we've got to look at where this money was in the 2008 and the 2012 area, and where it is moving towards. And I think, what's interesting for me is that BRI kind of relationship. And of course, within that, you had FOCAC, if I remember correctly, you have FOCAC 2015. And of course, you've got FOCAC front and center around the 2013-2017 period. And you can see where this is, where the funding was going to. You got transport, power, public administration, multi-sector extraction. The Boston University Center is actually saying that this is now becoming more and more, I would say, more and more about where the funding is going. So extractions are not happening. And if they are happening, they're happening with very key kind of actors. It may not be oil driven. It may be critical minerals. This is key for China in terms of the chip market industry, the semiconductor. I know Taiwan is a big semiconductor actor, but in terms of the chip market, the tensions between the US and China and this transport infrastructure, very key around the 2013, 2017. But then in 2018, 2021, part of it is also driven by the fact that COVID was in that period. But again, I think, if China's economy is rebounding in terms of its current account surplus, it's not being reflected in the amount of money that they're lending out. And that's a slide. If you can get a copy of this Boston Development Policy Center policy brief, you'll find that the correlation between China's a kind of current account surplus and when it's lending, it's kind of tapering off. And that's what I want to point out here, that there's a tapering off of the sectors and where this is going. And I think, again, these numbers require us to be much more pragmatic, much more realistic about FOCAC 2024. And Paul, please tell me if I'm over time, so so I can actually get carried away at times. And one of the things I think is important for us to bear in mind is also to understand, what is the kind of lending between the China Development Bank and the Exim Bank, and of course the World Bank, and what we are seeing in terms of where sectors are getting funded by the World Bank and what is getting funded by the Exim Bank and the Development Bank of China. And you can see this again, that in the extraction pipelines around those kinds of infrastructure, I think you're going to see the Chinese playing a critical role. But in terms of the public administration, discretionary funds, it seems the World Bank is still the kind of lender of choice in that way, or countries are turning to the World Bank. And of course, look at agriculture. We hear that agriculture is key to the Chinese engagement in Africa. But again, this is going to be critical in terms of what type of agriculture you're going to be looking at, what kind of agro-processing. If Africa is going to make a dent in not just the Chinese market, but also in the global market in terms of these sectors. So the telecoms, I think I would circle as a key area as well. I would circle power generation and linked to particular transport projects, but also power generation in terms of linking to connectivity. And these are things that we got to start thinking about much more clearly. One of the things I want to put on the table, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, is whether the kind of shift away from a kind of new development financing from China, the small is beautiful approach, also means that African countries will turn more and more to the World Bank, the IMF, in terms of the kinds of financing arrangements they will look for. And what does this mean for the debt question in Africa? We keep hearing about the debt trap in Africa, but I think we've got to now be much more on the ball and much more aware of what's going on within the African financial markets, within the African equity markets, in terms of where financing is coming from. So I think, just to contextualize that as well. So I found this quote by the former Nigerian Minister of Transport very interesting, because I think it captures what we are talking about in terms of mega regional projects, or even mega bilateral projects, that the Chinese are no longer funding them. Now, what does that mean? I don't think it means completely moving out, but I think it's a much more kind of review of where China is. Where is it going to be funding projects? Where is it going to be looking at particular issues? How does it fit within this new kind of development financing era that China is moving towards? And I think it's going to be very linked to China's national interest, to link back to what China's development agenda is, and whether or not it's synchronizing with Africa's development agenda. And it does place Africa at a crossroads for infrastructure development financing, because the African Development Bank had indicated that the deficit or the gap in terms of Africa's infrastructure funding deficit is about $176 billion a year. Where is that money going to come from? And this idea that development financing is shifting towards small is beautiful, how do you fit FOCAC within that context of this new era of Chinese development finance? What will be the spillover effects? What will be the kind of advice we as policy think tanks will give to this think tank discussion, to our different national dialogues that we should be having on FOCAC, not just in the FOCAC year, but as the run-up to FOCAC, in reflecting on where China has moved in the period since the last FOCAC, and are we prepared for that? So I think there's a lot here that gives us traction, but the question is, how do we take those national interests and collectively bring them to a kind of regional continental interest? And I think sometimes we kind of talk in a very abstract way about, this is what needs to be done, that needs to be done. I think it starts with really being, being much more pragmatic and realistic about the engagement. So for me, I'm raising the question in terms of where we are. What does this mean for FOCAC? Smaller projects, smaller loans. profitability and viability of projects. I think the question here is China is not exceptional in this. Like every other actor that actually invests in Africa or anywhere else in the world, the challenge for these lenders is, I remember when I did my one of my projects at the Human Sciences Research Council, and we were looking at the Chinese, not the Chinese, the South African corporates that were investing in Africa, and they were quite big corporate, big investors at the time. China wasn't even a player at that point in time. And one of the banks, when we did an interview, said to me, "Ms. Naidu, you must remember the business of business is business." And that stuck with me for the longest time and still remains at the back of my mind when I think about profitability and viability of financing, because nobody wants to make a bad investment. Nobody wants to be overrun on their investments. We see the challenges that came out of the Standard Gauge Railway, not just for Kenya, but also for China. Do you actually do your feasibility studies? What's happening domestically in Africa also plays a critical role for investor confidence and so forth. I think the other point to make is if the policy banks in China, or there's a reduction of policy funding from policy banks or from the Exim and the Development Bank, then there's more diverse funding sources. And we saw this being discussed in the 2021 FOCAC summit, where there was questions about how do you bring in actors like the private sector. So the funds of helping private sector companies, SMEs, etc. We're going to see a little more of that, but it's going to be more about the challenge, the underwriting of risk, and who takes on this underwriting of risk if projects overrun. I think when you start going to private equity markets and you start borrowing from the private equity markets, there are higher capital costs, but there's also higher expectations and much more inbuilt conditions around delivering of the project. So this is some of the stuff that I think is becoming interesting. We saw in the Dakar declaration of FOCAC that build, operate, transfer. This is key, I think, to also not just funding of diversifying funding sources, but also aligning to operational and mechanics of how projects will be undertaken going forward. For me, the priorities of renewable energy technology, digital connectivity, data centers, green finance are going to be key areas here as well, because this aligns to the small and beautiful kind of approach, but it also aligns to the GDI, to the kind of GSI that we spoke about. That what do you want people to have? They want them to have access to renewable energy, generation, transmission investments, connectivity around these areas, but also I think it's going to be about the technology and the digital connectivity. So the thing that I find interesting is locating FOCAC within the BRI, but where is BRI going as well? Because we need to understand that. Is it this ever ready, or this energizer battery that just keeps going and going and going? Or is it really around the idea that BRI is also stabilizing and becoming more and more of just another, the philosophy of what China sees as the kind of digitization and the digitizing of its interests, EV batteries, etc., and going into building supercomputers and super internet and all kinds of technology and other military capacities, but also in terms of bringing the kind of connectivity, renewable energy, access to electricity, etc., in terms of the next FOCAC summit and what we're going to see there. And of course, the green finance is critical. The one area I didn't put here, which I should have now with hindsight, is what Xi Jinping said last year on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in terms of addressing the trade deficit with Africa. And the numbers came out in January, and we see the trade deficit is ballooning in terms of where it was in 2022. It's gone up to about $64 billion, etc. And that was a key concern when President Ramaphosa and President Xi Jinping had that meeting with African partners on the sidelines, and it was a special meeting with African countries on the sideline of BRICS, and spoke about duty-free, market-free access, addressing the deficit, and making sure that China buys more from Africa. But this comes with all kinds of disclaimers as well. There are all kinds of inherent challenges and contradictions in the agreements that you have. How much of value addition is going to impact on African countries in terms of tariff escalations? What about non-tariff barriers? I mean, it's not just statements that you can just say. You've got to start disaggregating those statements and start unpacking those statements. And then, of course, I try to come back to what Paul was asking me to do and come back to the national interests. And I think the national interest is, so is it going to be a FOCAC light in 2024? And I spoke to one or two colleagues who are much more knowledgeable than I am on this topic, and have been following it in a much more a manifested way. They're constantly tracking this. And one of the things they said to me was this expectation that FOCAC will be the kind of effervescence that will just continue in the same manner like it did should start to now be tempered. That there will be continuity with things like debt forgiveness, structural engagements, projects that will continue to make China's profile in Africa important. But I don't think we should have any expectation about a value or a figure that's going to be attached to this development package. I mean, in 2021, it was 40 billion, but there's a question mark there. So what's in a number? The $40 billion question is really about how much is China going to give us? And how much of this is going to be new development packages? How much of this is going to be hangover? How much of this has not been accounted for? It's about moving projects on the books. How do we separate a BRI project from a FOCAC project? What constitutes a GDI project? I mean, these are all questions that kind of, we should be engaging with on this, and we hear about legacy projects like the Tazara Railway. Will this still be part of the 2024 projects that kind of talk to the historical engagement, the friendship, the solidarity, the relationship in terms of, and I'm sorry I misspelled Tazara there, but the thing that I needed to also ask myself is, how much are we monitoring? I mean, it's okay to get all of the information from a dedicated Chinese website on FOCAC, but how much of this should be the AU talking about a monitoring and evaluation? Because I think it's a segue to how do you actually engage with not just China, but it's how do you develop your agency with all external partners? I mean, this year in June, South Korea is going to host its first Africa Summit. There are projects that, for example, in Uganda was trying to get funding for phases of the Standard Gauge Railway, and they couldn't get that. There was another railway project in Uganda for 8 years, couldn't get funding from the Chinese. Eventually, Turkey came in and provided the funding. So I think understanding the relationship is one thing, understanding how this relationship is evolving and what is being monitored and evaluated and what is being then sent to our governments as South Africa, as Tanzania, as Nigeria, as Ghana, or even to the AU as having one kind of set of core evaluation monitoring report is critical, because this then gives the AU some kind of traction with the AU ambassador in Beijing. But what I fear is, are we going to see how African countries are going to mitigate the internal competition around FOCAC? If the actual development finance package is 40 billion again, or if it's reduced even further, that means that that 54 countries are competing for a very, very small slice of the pie. And again, we should ask ourselves, where does FOCAC fit in the broader global dimensions of China's interest? And I raised the question of, is Latin America the new impetuous for China? I was with colleagues from different countries that are working on China in their respective regions. I was on a study tour to Washington last year, and listening to the Latin American academics talk about what China is doing in Argentina, creating these lithium parks and coming in for this extraction around lithium, etc., I think is really important. And somebody said to me, look at FOCAC and then look how China is fashioning its Latin American strategy as well. So I think we've got to be realistic about where we are, what we're doing, and how much of this should not be about hype, but really about tempering what the national interest is that filters to the regional and then becomes part of the continental kind of I would say not a blueprint. You can never have a blueprint. There's no one size fits all approach, but just kind of giving that thought process and the kind of research that you want. And I think this is the game that you're seeing. China was critical in setting up the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. BRICS, in terms of how it moved BRICS in the inclusion of South Africa, and then moved the the outreach partnership to BRICS Plus, and now the expansion. And I don't like the point that it's an answer to the G7. I think it's about how do you manage this global stage, which is becoming much more pluralistic and much more unpredictable, or not necessarily just having one center of power. And then the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and of course I spoke about the GCI and the GSI. And I think all of this kind of has to be located within the context of this question. How does Africa start to strategize? Africa has to start strategizing its agency in FOCAC and with other external partners. So for me, the national interest is not just one national interest. It's many national interests, but what is the convergence of those national interests? And I think the role for us in the policy think tank world, in the research world, in the academic world, is to start thinking about what we do in answering this question going forward. And I think for me, the challenges are really now that China seems to be, and I don't say this in a manner that I want to be kind of frivolous, but are we seeing a much more kind of maturing of the Africa-China relationship, or the China-Africa relationship? And I'll stop with that, Paul, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanusha. That was very deep and insightful. I think you brought us a lot of questions, and I think it's very key going forward. I believe that you set the tone very much for the conversation. China is changing, and we need to be very, very realistic in terms of the measuring, tracking, and measuring the kind of relation that we have with China, right? Because FOCAC itself has evolved, as you mentioned. Now we're talking about small is beautiful. You showed the numbers in terms of even investment in the extraction sector now moving to other areas as well. He mentioned about even trying, President Xi Jinping mentioned last year. I have a question even regarding that. Mentioned how to bridge the trade, gap between China and Africa. So I believe that this has been very insightful. That is it the same FOCAC that we used to know with these big numbers in terms of financial commitment and big projects as we saw, or because of the changing dynamics, China's own economic changes, its own foreign policy initiatives. Like you said, now in recent time, we have the GDI, Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, we have the GCI, Global Civilization Initiative, the role it's playing at the BRICS level, the BRI being a huge part of it. So it's kind of want us to still, like you're saying, still have to dig deeper from the African perspective of what we are seeing happening on the FOCAC. I think it's very important. You ask all the right questions, really, and then we can situate that to our national interests, at the continental level about this FOCAC. And it's going to happen again this year, as we did mention earlier, so that we can all go to such platform with that kind of realistic ideas, around what is really happening. Because if we jump all these happenings within this period, like the GDI, the GCI, the GSI, the BRI, if we jump all of them and not really look at them critically, even the last part that you mentioned about China's even engagement in Latin America, as you mentioned, how does all of that situate in terms of the FOCAC's, role going forward? I think it's very, very important, and we really, really appreciate the insight that you've shared. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open. You can bring in your questions so that Sanusha can really answered. We don't have much time because I didn't want to stop her
No,
because the information she was
it's
giving
okay.
was.
I got some
Yeah,
time. I can spend.
yeah.
Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay, sure, right. So that's perfect. So during last year's BRICS, on the sideline of the BRICS, there was as you mentioned earlier, the conversation between President Xi and then the African leaders, where there were three new initiatives again that came up. Of course, we talk about industrialization drive, agriculture modernization, of course, talent development. And I'm interested in the agriculture one, right? Because you mentioned that is a component of how we can actually bridge the gap in terms of trade deficit, because then we talk about value addition, all of that. So what do you make of that kind of because again, when you track the pillars of FOCAC, agriculture has almost always featured every year.
Yeah.
And even the Dakar 2021, agriculture is still mentioned, and we know there's been numerous support system in terms of the kind of agriculture that we need in Africa to build the kind of sustainability and resilience that we need. And of course, China could become a good example because they have history. Because you talk about the arable land size of China compared to Africa. I mean, there's no way Africa should be importing food from any part of the world when China is importing, but not as much as we are importing. So there's a huge lesson there to be learned, because we cannot be sitting on 60% of the world's arable land and still having a food related crisis, food security issues. So I believe that kind of conversation is very important. And so I wanted to ask you, how do we situate that in terms of Africa's agriculture? Because we have the I think comprehensive agriculture, Africa Agriculture Program. I mean, it's led by the African Development Bank, trying to see how we can modernize agriculture. So it's actually on the table for the African continent at that level that we want to modernize agriculture. So that is CAP. So how do we, connect this with what President Xi mentioned in the three initiatives for agriculture modernization, the FOCAC, and Africa's own, plans of, modernizing agriculture?
Okay. And there's another question in the Q&A around the win-win cooperation and infrastructure projects.
Okay. So I'll read that. So maybe, or you
Yeah,
want to tie that?
I'll start with yours and then I'll segue into that. Well, for me, those three points that President Xi Jinping made, it's not new points. It's part of the engagement. It's been always part of the engagement on the industrialization, the modernization, and looking at how you kind of create that access to the Chinese market. I stand corrected, and my memory does fade now that as I'm getting older. But one of the things that they did talk about was duty-free, quota-free access to the market in 2006. And one of the things that, we found when we were working at the Center for Chinese Studies is we asked for the list of what products get to go to China as duty-free, quota-free access. And it was a very ambiguous list. Things that you don't even think African countries produce, like steak knives or salad forks. I mean, it was so ambiguous that the question you had to ask yourself is, who compiled this list? Because for me, these statements that leaders make don't correlate or synthesize with what is happening within the industrial plans. How is China enabling those industrial plans? Now, I know it's not China's responsibility for African countries to be able to define measure and implement industrial plans that are essentially value addition. But I think the challenge is inherent within these bilateral agreements. Because remember, bilateral agreements do find a better traction than the multilateral or the continental things. And inherent in that is that sometimes there are conditions under which you export to China. So one of the things we discovered in South Africa, excuse me, is we export citrus fruit to Hong Kong and it gets to Shanghai, or now we go via, we export to Shanghai. And every single time that, and I don't know of late whether this still is a problem, but I know from the from the Citrus Association here in the Western Cape, they've been saying that they've been having challenges. And the challenge is that the customs authorities and the port authorities in Shanghai don't allow the product to go through. And the reason they cite is they keep looking for ways to stop the product because they don't want that product to disrupt their agricultural production in Western China or wherever they're producing all types of fruit. And I think that's the problem. The problem is you can modernize your agricultural production. You can talk about Africa being the bread basket of the world. But as soon as you have challenges around things like in tariff and non-tariff barriers, sanitary and phytosanitary, and China uses it, and so does other countries. There's no exception to what countries will do to protect their home industry, their home market. And so they do use the sanitary and phytosanitary requirements of the WTO. And of course, now we know that the Doha Development Round collapsed in Abu Dhabi, I think it was, that to keep products out that become more competitive in the market. So for example, if there's a foot and mouth outbreak disease in our so-called livestock industry, the Chinese will say, we can't import that beef from you, right? And this is not just a South African problem, Botswana also experienced this problem. There's a greater demand now for soya beans and other stuff that's coming out of Latin America, Argentinian beef and stuff. So where do we compete in this process of modernizing? How do we compete? And I think the point I want to make is that when we talk to policymakers, there's a very narrow interpretation of how China is going to be a kind of panacea for Africa's development. And the first thing you have to do is dissuade African policymakers, including sometimes the policy think tank world and the academic world, that it doesn't work like that in practice. So I think the first thing that we have to start thinking about is how do we integrate our markets amongst ourselves, intra-Africa trade? How do we actually don't set up barriers to products like, for example, Botswanan beef that can come to South Africa? The United Arab Emirates, or I think it's the UAE, is essentially now buying lamb and mutton from South Africa. That's the new agriculture. That's the deal they signed. But what does that mean? The product is going to be exported, and most of the model is about the export orientated growth model. So you already build into your modernization and of your agricultural sector and into the industrialization of your market is that a lot of what you're going to produce is not going to be for food security for people in Africa. It's going to be for export because there are no arable land in China. There's no arable land in the Gulf states. There's no not UAE. Saudi Arabia is going to buy lamb and sheep meat from us. So I think these are already looking at ways and means in terms of what happens to the relationship and the engagement. So I think for me, the challenge is not that we should take at face value what President Xi says and what President Ramaphosa says, because sometimes leaders don't know what especially in terms of what they're saying, they don't really sit at the coalface of what's happening. Because you're going to have a lot of important dynamics around, for example, if we have a swine flu in South Africa, the Chinese don't buy from us because they say that's all kind of corrupted in the value chain, in the value addition. If we want to sell, how do we compete with China in other spaces as well? So I'm not sure if I'm answering you, but I'm giving you examples of what does a statement like that mean and how do we unpack it and who actually is unpacking it and saying to the Chinese or to the Americans or to the European Union or to the Middle East or to anybody else, listen, you made a statement, but according to what is happening on the ground, it's not getting through. I mean, we have a similar challenge in South Africa when it comes to poultry and the export of chicken parts to the US. It's a massive problem for us in terms of where we are in the context of the poultry market and so forth, because we are not allowed to export certain parts of what is white meat and whatever, because the US has a monopoly on it. So it's the finer details of the statement that need to be unpacked. So I'm not saying it won't happen, but I'm saying we have to be much more sober about it. And if the President Xi Jinping said that, then we have to hold them accountable and say that what you are doing. But it starts with us first, going forward. Right.
Sure.
On the Q&A, I see more and more questions have come through.
Yeah. You want me
But
to read them? Maybe I can just.
no, I can read them. It's fine. Don't worry.
Okay.
So with regard to what Wayne was asking about win-win corporations in terms of infrastructure projects, I mean, you know, for me, the win-win is whether those projects are viable. They don't have a lifespan that exceeds their timeframes, and how much does the government that has been the recipient of the infrastructure project, how much do they get the benefit in a shorter time frame? And that for me is win-win. So if I go back to the Standard Gauge Railway, I think you can see that part of the Nairobi Expressway is essentially where it was managed by the consortium. And then, of course, that project then, once they reaped the reward, once they reaped the profit, then, of course, it went back to the Chinese, went back to the Nairobi authorities of the Kenyan government. But it'll take a while because, you know, the point is that it's a build, operate, transfer, but it may actually have benefit for one as a kind of win and not benefit for the other as a win-win. So for me, I think that the inherent challenge is in the disclosure agreements that are not made public in these infrastructure projects, and how much of it is extractive. I hope I've answered Wayne's question. With regard to the anonymous attendee that's asking if there's any evidence of China supporting value creation on the continent in minerals, I think it's a mixed one. I can't say with any authority. I haven't. I mean, I think there are other people on the as participants who will have more knowledge than me on this. I think if you look at the numbers where the trade has been really good for China and where South Africa or Nigeria, etc., have been the top 5 partners, I think there's only one country or 2 countries there that were mineral enriched countries, but that's more extractive than anything else. So a few years ago, the Chinese recorded like trade surpluses with 5 countries, and then of course in those countries they were actually non-enriched countries, so they were non-mineral rich countries. So it's a difficult one to answer because right now you get the sense that it's not necessarily about value production at source. It's more about extractives. And this is not just a China problem. It is a global problem for Africa. If you look at what's going on with that, the Beto corridor that the Americans want to reinvest in, if you look at the other what you call this, investments around the critical minerals corridors, I think Zimbabwe under the ZANU-PF 2 or 3 years ago made the statement that if you want our critical minerals, you got to produce at source. But I'm not sure how much of that is real value addition to policy development and policy creation for Zimbabwe, or how much of this is conjecture to try and just push the Chinese into a corner. So I think those are some of the debates that we have. Is the failure of African country states repayment for existing debts a main risk and pushback for investment? I think it's part of the problem. It's definitely looking at, again, timeframes, looking at projects that actually exceed the time frame and then become more expensive for the Chinese. And the other issue for me is commodity booms, bust and boom cycles, which is again a problem for African countries that depend on these commodity boom and bust cycles for payment of their debt and so forth. So I think, you know, to be more candid, Moshe, I think the challenge is that the the Chinese are becoming more realistic about what they can invest and where they want to invest, and I think you got to also be looking at the fact that that elements of the BRI will be much more about geographical connectivity and geostrategic connectivity within Asia, connecting those dynamics as well. We recently read a piece that said that India and Iran are looking at creating a corridor that's going to compete with China, with the port in Pakistan, because a lot that's going on in the south, in the Red Sea, is affecting maritime security, and is affecting shipping lanes and so forth. So I think it's also looking at where your pragmaticness lies. And remember, I always tell my students the world is round in terms of how you connect. You don't fly from Japan to Abu Dhabi and then onto Europe, or then onto Alaska. You actually can fly because it's a Pacific Ocean. It goes the other way as well. So I think the North Sea, the North Corridor, those are things that are coming in. And I would suggest look at India as well and what's going on there. So the repayment issue is not just one factor. It's about how some of these structural conditions in the market particularly also play a role in terms of whether the commodity boom and bust cycles are not being utilized in terms of forex or whatever, money that is not being utilized for overhung expenses on projects that just become too expensive and cannot be completed in time. And of course, I think the other issue is inherent corruption as well in some of these projects. How much of money that has to be kind of used in order to have the financing space, and to have for example, in Kenya, it was about parts of communities and leaders in those communities that had to deal with the authorities had to deal with that. So it's a kind of revolving door of issues. The US-Chinese
I wanted to I wanted to just make a comment on this. I think you're right. I mean, the existing inability of African government to repay their debts is also is a contributing factor. Of course, China is not naive on what is happening on the African continent. Of course, it even led to, I think you briefly touched on what led to what we call the debt trap diplomacy, which is being used, kind of against China's investment engagement on the African continent. That they're saying that China is consciously giving money to countries on the continent of Africa that cannot really pay them back, so that they can confiscate their which is neither here nor there, because the fact does not support that. I research that backs the fact that it doesn't support that kind of narrative, because as you mentioned earlier, the business of business is business. There's no way any country will willingly give money to a particular country knowing that that particular country cannot pay, so they can go. Why would you go through that process? I believe that they are monitoring the dynamics as happening on the African continent. Of course, there are a number of countries on the continent that are going through debt-related crises. My own country, Ghana, defaulted last year on a external debt repayment. Of course, led to debt restructuring that we have to do, domestic debt restructuring. Now we are still on our debt, external debt restructuring. We are now have to go on the IMF program, which is we're still under almost a year into the IMF program. So the reality is that there are these challenges in terms of African governments' inability to repay their debt. And of course, when you look at the narrative around it, China is almost always mentioned. So because they're not naive, and of course, as a responsible partner will be, you have to really re-strategize and really look at how you actually finance the kind of projects that are happening. And as you mentioned, small and beautiful projects. So I believe that kind of scenario that most countries on the African continent find themselves in is also a contributing factor. And it's real that China will have to relook and re-strategize on what to get into. And of course, until when the way is clear that we can then jump onto other mega project they can do that. Of course, again, China's own internal economic changes as well, also a contributing factor. So I think that's the comment that I wanted to make in addition to what you mentioned. So we can go to the next question.
Yeah, and just before I answer Mika's question there, I think just to also contextualize, how much of debt is multilateral debt for countries and how much of it is bilateral. I think Kenya recently showed that China's debt was not as astronomical in terms of who they owed to. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, when you talk to people and they come with the debt trap diplomacy, sometimes it is magnified in a manner that doesn't contextualize it in relation to other creditors. And there was a very interesting piece, I don't know if it was in the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, that some of Africa's debt is being bought up by private venture capitalists, vulture capital, they call it. And because they see this as a return, as a major return. So, debt is now becoming an investment for certain private companies and vulture capitalists. So I think it's a very important point to bear in mind that private debt is probably higher than bilateral debt. But then debt is debt, whatever it is, you have to pay back your debt no matter what.
Even in the case of Ghana, I mean, our total external debt as at 2023 stood at about $30 billion. And out of this 30 billion, this external, not the total debt, the external debt alone. And out of this, I think $1.9 billion is owed to China, which is around 6%, give or take, right? So our total external debt, the entire total external, only 6% of our total external debt is owed to China, right? So, but then, of course, it is still the largest bilateral, figure, because that's the context that you're talking about. It's still the largest bilateral, but it's just around 6%. We have 94% of our total external debt to other multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the private, through the Euro bonds that the government issued from the Wall Street to London and what have you. So they own together 94% of the country's total. So, but the narrative again is like, because we are in debt crisis because of China. So that was the narrative, that we are where we are because of China, but that's not the case. Again, we even go to the extent of asking critical questions about getting deeper into what those debts are actually used for, right? So, for example, we understand, I think you mentioned the figure that currently we need about the infrastructure deficit is about $170 billion according to the African Development Bank. And I think last year, the African Development Bank alone just only did about 10 billion from the African Development Bank. Yeah. So we have over $150 billion of gap that needs to be filled. So if Ghana is taking about $1.9 billion from China, we also need to understand that these projects, these investments are capital intensive, right? So a small country like, let's say, Zambia, whatever, you can just pay about $1 billion. That can shoot the country's debt to above the sustainability level, but it's according to what they are going to use the money for. And we all know, I mean, the most indebted country in the world is the United States of America, trillions of dollars, right? But of course, we talk about the capacity to repay, which is very key. So I believe that we need to contextualize the conversation about the debts and what role is it in terms of what the continent countries owe to China, so that we do not exaggerate the fact that countries are where they are because China is giving them money in investment.
Yeah. And I completely agree, because I think it's a nice segue, Paul, into the question that was raised about US-Chinese rivalry. How is it affecting FOCAC? I mean, about 4 weeks ago, I was privileged to speak to a group of American representatives from Congress, and their view is still about how does China indebt Africa, and they kept reiterating the debt narrative, the debt diplomacy narrative. They kept reiterating about, is China, I mean, let me give you a quote, which is I think this quote captures what was asked about the rivalry. And the quote is very much a quote that I had to put it in my presentation. And the quote is from Molly Fee, the US Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. And she says, if Africa didn't exist, we would be fully engaged in Africa. Africa is important for its own sake, and it's important for American interests. So that alone tells you that it's all about the optics. It's all about the kind of dangers that China represents. But the rivalry between US and China, some people will argue, yes, it's creating a kind of reawakening in Washington, that they have to now have the B3W, the Build Better. They want to have these infrastructure corridor projects like the Lobito one that they want to invest in. They want to go into Power Africa, and they're doing that a lot as well, because that's a generation capacity. And they want to connect more cities. But I think the real issue, the real competition will be in the critical minerals, because a lot of the critical minerals is around how does American companies compete with China. And it's fascinating, because this week we saw that that Joe Biden has now removed the emergency orders on Zimbabwe. And where he had created, because of the instability and the political crisis in the country, he placed a whole lot of people. He issued the emergency order against Zimbabwe, and more sanctions or whatever. And it was curious, because when he said, when that White House statement came out, and people said, oh, he removed it, now he's not going to have Zimbabwe on this watch list and the emergency order and whatever. And immediately people asked, what do you think were the underlying factors for this? And somebody in a chat said to me, in a group chat said, you know what? It may be linked to the fact that there's a critical minerals corridor, a railway corridor that will touch Zimbabwe. And US business is worried about that, because it will be extractive around iron ore. And it was not necessarily an argument that was based on, it was just a point, like, let's start thinking about this. And so that's the one area of how it will affect FOCAC. I think the other area of FOCAC, which we don't speak about a lot, is the global health diplomacy, the health diplomacy parts of FOCAC. Are we going to see, under BRI, we spoke about green finance, we spoke about digital connectivity, but global health is also very important. Health diplomacy is important. But in Africa, I think it's important to also look at how in the last FOCAC, where countries that did not provide the vaccine for COVID, or were vaccine hoarding, where President Ramaphosa in his speech at the FOCAC summit in Senegal online spoke and praised President Xi Jinping and China for acceding and coming to Africa's request for vaccines. Of course, there are other dynamics to that, right? You speak to people about the vaccine itself. Did it go through the proper trials? Was it the one that they used? I mean, there's all kinds of debates about the ethical research and development questions and how this vaccine came about. But that's a different debate. But what I think it does, it creates that image that, where countries have in the developed world have essentially used vaccine apartheid to prevent people in Africa from getting the access to the vaccine. And when they did get the vaccine, it was either expired or wasn't this thing. The same thing happened with the vaccines that came from China, right? People weren't using them. But the fact of the matter is that the optics and the imagery was that they released this vaccine. They gave this vaccine. And in South Africa, our Health Practitioners Association was very wary about where we go with this. So I think that the competition is layered again. It's layered around the infrastructure. It's layered around digital connectivity. It's layered on health issues. And if you think about the health issues as well, is China's building health infrastructure, hospitals and clinics or whatever. And they may be using certain levels in which you have to do training in China, and come back and maybe there's infrastructure in terms of equipment. But I still think, and this is just from my very cursory interpretation, is I still think that the US is a bigger actor in Africa when it comes to health. You've got PEPFAR, you've got different types of things that they are doing. Look at the Gates Foundation and what they are doing in terms of building up these kinds of pandemic responses and so forth. The question would be that rivalry as well. How does that affect FOCAC? Are we going to be having just demonstration centers and health clinics, etc.? So I think it's multi-layered, and I don't have an exhaustive answer for you because I'm looking at time, and I know we got two other questions, but I think you got to frame it along those lines. And I think the other rivalry would be on media and how media plays a role in shaping narratives. I don't know if you want to say anything, Paul.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, that's good. It's enough. Yeah.
Okay. So Joel asked about the diversifying of products to China from minerals into agro products and avocados. Yeah, I agree with you. We kind of get caught up in the numbers game, and we kind of actually say the challenge is that we can because there's a big demand for avocados in China. Now we'll export all of our avocados to China. Or there's a big demand for beef or lamb or citrus products. We'll export. That doesn't solve the problem, because it doesn't mean that that demand is going to continue on a trajectory that's sustainable. If tomorrow China gets better avocados from Australia, they will take it despite the political dynamics. So it's always about this idea of how do we understand the economic relationship. It's not the economic relationship for the most of the world, and in terms of the model that we use, is always transactional, and it's very transactional. But the problem with it is that we're only looking at exporting all of the good stuff out of the continent and leaving the bad stuff in the continent. And to a large extent, I know in the Western Cape, where I live in Cape Town, all our good fruit is exported to other parts of the world. And so when they actually sell the fruit in the supermarket, it's frozen for days. And when you buy it, it completely goes rotten within 24 hours. It goes bad. So what we have to start thinking about is, how do we address Paul's point about having 60% of arable land, but dealing with issues of food security? Because everything can't be exported, because the money that's coming in is not being used for food security. And the last point about the ANC and the upcoming election, expecting China relations, I'm not saying that there's going to be a fundamental shift in South Africa's foreign policy around the upcoming elections. I think we are so seized with our elections at a domestic level. Who's going to come into power? Is it going to be a coalition? Will the ANC get more than 50%? Who the coalition partners will be if it gets 48%? The one thing we have seen in the ANC's election manifesto launch, and in subsequent election manifesto discussions and on the campaign trail up until now, is the feature of the Palestinian issue and the Gaza issue. I mean, no other political party has done it in such a grand scale. And that's because the ANC has taken on this idea that they were the ones that pushed the ICJ through the government. So in terms of the foreign policy, if you go and look at the manifestos, they're not saying much about a refocus of foreign policy. In fact, all of the manifestos seem to be quite foreign policy light. And even the official opposition, the DA, hasn't really come up with a foreign policy trajectory. I think they're all looking at domestication issues. They're all looking at what's going on in terms of the crime, the safety, security, the employment, the economy, all of that. So I would say that for now, we're a little bit safe on the foreign policy. It's not as good. It's not good that we have a foreign policy that's kind of very ambiguous, but this is where we are. And I can't see that shift. I don't think we're going to see that shift, but I could be wrong.
Thank you very much, Sanusha. I think you're right on the dot. We've done, I think, an hour and 30 minutes or so, exactly the time frame that we gave ourselves. I think it's a very insightful conversation so far, and we very much appreciate you for making the time to share this insight with us. Can
I just make one point? It just popped into my head to the last question. Sorry, Paul, I know you want to finish. I think it's interesting because in other African countries, like in Zambia previously, and of course in Kenya, China features in the election campaign. It features in their domestic affairs. For us, it's a very difficult one to disaggregate in terms of whether it features. The one that does feature for us, and I'll be as candid as I can, because I know you're going to put it up, so I may get a lot of body blows after this. But one of the things that's fascinating about our election is it's about foreign migrants. So it's not China per se, or this person or this country per se, but it's the foreign migrants and how they are impacting, and it circles back to the domestic issues. So I just want to put that point up for the last question.
Thank you very much, Sanusha. So all too soon, we've come to the end of today's webinar. The webinar session has been recorded. In the coming days, we'll put it up on our YouTube channel and we share with all participants as well. We are so much grateful for all of you for joining. Our special thanks to, of course, Sanusha for making the time to join us. So Sanusha is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue at the UNISA, but she's based in Cape Town. So she's done extensive research. I would recommend that you check her out on LinkedIn. You can connect with her. And then, of course, engage her if you have any further questions. Of course, you also have access to our email. So in case you have any questions regarding today's webinar, please, you're still allowed to send them and I'll run them through to Sanusha to answer them for you. So we'll come your way again. Again, you can visit our website, the africachinacenter.org, for more information on our upcoming webinars that you can sign up for. Until we meet again, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Sanusha.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you. It was been such a lovely conversation, and I look forward to continuing the partnership.
Definitely. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.